Every once in a while, there comes a fighting game that has somehow slipped past my radar, that once I discover it, I get frustrated at the fact that I hadn't been chilling and playing the game for its entirety. Okay, that's like the entire genre. The fighting game genre has way too many good games and hidden gems, and this happens all the time. But that's exactly how I felt about a little game that I've only been able to recently come around to, because PS3 emulation is, actually pretty good now. This fighting game is Chaos Breaker, or better known as its console release title, Dark Awake, The King Has No Name, which is just a beautiful subtitle, and I think every fighting game should have a dumb, mouthful nonsense subtitle just like that. Dark Awake is a 3v3 Western fantasy themed fighting game, where barbarians face off against orcs, rangers fight warlocks, and dwarves fight dragons. Just your average Dungeons & Dragons session turned into a fighting game, and I love that, because I'm a big D&D nerd. Just taking a brief look at Dark Awake might have you thinking that you've stumbled upon a lost late 90s pre-rendered American Hercules or Conan the Barbarian fighting game. But it's a lot more interesting than that because of the team behind the game. The developers behind Dark Awake are the Korean company Eolith, who SNK heads might recognize as the team behind The King of Fighters 2001 and The King of Fighters 2002. Being the developer of one of the most beloved fighting games ever obviously gives you some credibility. So it's no wonder that Taito teamed up with Eolith to make Dark Awake as their premier fighting game for their new Taito X arcade hardware back in 2004. And boy, did it stand out. Compared to the other big Japanese fighters at the time, Dark Awake's focus on Western fantasy tropes and the unique pre-rendered art style really set it apart, and it still stands out till this day. Dark Awake has this unique, small and almost toy-like look to me, almost as if the characters were molded out of clay. Which as someone who's spent a lot of money on minifigures for D&D, I'm a big fan of. While obviously being based on Tolkien-esque fantasy, there is still some obvious East Asian flair in the character designs that creates a cool take on generic fantasy design tropes from an outside view. But I can't help to wonder if the setting and look of Dark Awake was just not a popular choice for Japanese arcade goers in the mid-2000s, because the game failed to really make a splash sadly, and the Taito X arcade hardware wouldn't really be known for fighting games until the Taito X2 came out 3 years later, which had games like BlazBlue bring out the renaissance for anime fighters, and by that time Taito wasn't even attempting to lead the charge for fighting games on their own hardware. So another unique little fighting game was doomed to arcade hardware obscurity, until out of nowhere 6 years later the game was ported to PS3. In Japan only. But like I said before, emulation has given the game another chance, so let's take a look at it. So after mashing start to skip an English-filled intro that talks about how gods and dragons fought wars and a dragon was sealed away or something, we're met with, this. Jesus Christ, who thought this was the best first impression? Imagine seeing this jump scare at 3 AM. But after that, we can finally play the game. So Dark Awake is a 4-button game, with A, B, and C being your standard light, medium, and heavy attacks, and D usually being a non-weapon kick attack. Specials are done with your standard quarter circle and DP motions, with supers being double quarter circle motions mostly, and combos are usually normally just buttons going into links or specials into super cancels, but you can get fancy with juggles. But that's the basic stuff. What sets Dark Awake apart is that it's a 3v3 fighter where team composition is a bit more involved than just picking a point, middle, and anchor character, because this game has assist characters. By pressing the designated button combination for the characters on the sidelines, you can spend a bar to call an assist that range in all different kinds of utility. With it being tied to a resource and having a bit of recovery, don't expect to be calling assists to cover your neutral all day like in Marvel though. Keen eyes have probably also noticed another slot on the screen, and that's because not only do you pick 3 characters, but you also get to pick an item to help your team. These are your standard RPG items, like a healing or mana potion, to different kinds of weapons like the Goblin Spear or the Shining Bow, to other magical trinkets like the Medal of Strength or the Wind Boots. There are 32 different items, and as you can see, they vary a lot, so let's go over some of them. Items like the healing potion are pretty self-explanatory. You pop it and gain some health back. Each item has a different amount of uses, and one use comes back after a round of the match is finished. Using one of the item weapons gives access to a new attack, while wearable items give the most unique abilities, like the wind boots being able to create shadows of your characters to apply better pressure. But of course, as with all fighting games, it's a lot more complicated than just that. Some items you equip can give you passive abilities, like the healing potion will give you more health back at the end of the round automatically, or picking a weapon like the Hellfire Sword will raise physical attack stats for your character, and if you pick a weapon that happens to be the signature weapon of a particular character on your team, they'll get even more of a boost. So like with the Earth Hammer, if you pick Cursehead with this weapon, he'll do more damage across the board, because this is his weapon. It's kinda goofy, but we're not done with the item mechanics, as you can also use an item burst, which is another offensive attack that is unique to the different items that cost a bar of meter to dish out. It might seem like a lot to take in, but it's a pretty unique idea to push variety among the same characters, while not being as drastic as something like a Groove or Moon Select from CVS2 or Classic Melty. I just wish using both of the items and assists were easier to flow into combos or set play, but I appreciate their additions regardless. Finally, let's take a look at the two defensive mechanics in the game. First is the mana counter, which is your typical block stun counter you've seen in other games. And then you have clashing, which is... oh, wait a minute. Oh baby, we got parries in this game! Clashing is essentially Dark Awake's parry, because it stops the game, gives you frame advantage, and lets you cancel into another move to punish. As its name implies, clashing can be done on weapon attacks that are hitting at the same time, similar to something like Guilty Gear. But way more interestingly, it can also be done off your character's dash, or even a back dash, because dashes have a certain amount of active clash frames during the animation. And I kinda love this. It feels very, and I apologize for how dated this sounds, Leroy Jenkinsy? Obviously I'm not playing this game at the highest level possible, and I can't tell you the frame data on any of this stuff. So the idea of sitting in neutral and just mashing a dash hoping to catch a parry is a lot of hilarious fun. Even with all of these crazy mechanics though, I feel like this game is a lot more footsie and poke heavy based than you'd probably think. And while you can do some crazy combos, I don't think a casual fighting game enjoyer would have a hard time getting into this game at all. At least until all of the item stuff is explained to them. But enough about mechanics. Let's take a look at the characters that hit all of the Western fantasy tropes. We have 18 characters representing 6 different fantasy races. We have humans, elves, dwarves, monsters, undeads, and dark elves. Taking a deeper look, we have Ramda as our human protagonist, who is definitely not Conan the Barbarian. Funnily enough, in the original arcade release of Dark Awake, Chaos Breaker, Ramda has a more JRPG look to him, but they barbarianed him out for the console release, along with Sandra. You can still select their old looks in this release by holding select while picking them though. For the elves, I want to highlight Yvetta, as she's probably my favorite character in the game. She's your typical ranger elf, but with a sick DP and fun combos. The dwarves have your Amber and Axe bros covered, but there's also Gerhardsen II, who just straight up fights you with a giant cannon. The monster team is the most unique, because we have a tiny goblin who rides a lizard into battle, a giant troll who takes up more than half the screen, and an orc who commands others to fight for him. The undeads are obviously evil, with Incidor being my favorite, because he rides on a skeleton horse. He doesn't have a real jump and his crouch is still taller than most characters standing, but he's just so super unique and cool. And finally, the Dark Elves are more sinister counterparts of our human heroes in theming. I like Mara because he's a cool necromancer and his animations rule. There are still tons of characters I didn't cover, like this giant dude or this waifu bait, so there's still more to explore so you can find your perfect team. Unless you want to be that annoying friend and pick some bosses, which you can do by holding select and pressing either weak, medium, or heavy attack on the random select button. You can play as the Manicore, the evil sorceress Theo, or even the final boss himself, the king with no name, who's just a giant dragon and is super unique and obviously isn't fair in the slightest. The mirror match is fun though. All in all, even though the cast is pretty tropey, there are still some unique designs and even more unique gameplay styles for these characters, so I think this is a pretty good roster. While slipping under my radar, Dark Awake still has its fans and scene, as the PS3 release did have some players outside of Japan grinding it back in the day, and there was a tournament for it at EVO Japan 2020. But just like me, I feel like there has been a more recent unearthing of this fantasy oddity through emulation, which I'm super thankful for, because more people get to play it, and some people are even running online tournaments for it through Parsec. So I hope this can show that there is still interest in this game, and that we can get a more modern release for it that we can actually support. But until then, try and check out this game any way you can, because it's a cool one. Thanks.